remarks by welcoming you, introducing myself. I'm Ron Linden, Director of the European Union Center of Excellence and European Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh. This is the second in our series of conversations on Europe devoted to contemporary developments. And I want to welcome participants here, UNC Chapel Hill, University of Texas at Austin, Alex Privitera, and our friends at Bayer here in the Pittsburgh suburb who are joining us. Before I begin, I want to thank the technical people who've made this possible and the people who did all the work to get it set up. Karen Lautinen and Allison Delnor and Mark Weichsel here at Pitt, Steve Kirby and Tom Cox at UNC, Ian Campbell at UT Austin, and our partner at Bayer, Daniel Anderson. Today, we are going to be devoting our attention to the developments in Europe with a specific focus on Germany. And I'd like to introduce our panelists. To my left is Steve Sokol, who is President and Chief Executive Officer of the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh. Dr. Sokol previously served as Vice President and Director of Programs at the American Council on Germany, and he holds a PhD in Law and Policy from Northeastern University and is a long-time but not old German hand. Hopefully joining us from Berlin is Professor Gary Marks, who is the Burton-praised Distinguished Professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and founding director of the Center for European Studies at UNC. He also holds a chair in multi-level governance at VU Amsterdam, and his PhD is from Stanford. Joining us from Texas, Professor Sabina Hake, who holds the Texas Chair of German Literature and Culture at the University of Texas. She is well known to us because she was on our faculty for 16 years. Her DPhil is from the University of Hanover, and she's a specialist in areas of German culture and German cinema. And we especially wanted her to join us today to give us a humanities perspective. Also, we wanted a non-academic, you might say, to join us, and we asked Alexander Privitera, who is a journalist and associated with the American Institute on Contemporary German Studies. He's currently the U.S. correspondent for the German news channel N24 and also appears on cable news throughout the United States. We will proceed as follows. Everyone who's plugged in should be able to hear and see and react to the conversation. I would ask you, however, when you're not speaking, to put your microphones on mute. Therefore, there won't be too much ambient noise around that we are hearing. When you do pose a question, I know it will be repetitive, but preface it by saying who you are and where you're coming from. Right, excellent. That will give the technology a chance to kick in, and it brings up on the screen the person who's asking the question. This is a panel discussion in which we will pose questions. I will do my best to moderate among the panelists and our audience and handle questions, and we'll try to get everyone involved. If I appear to be missing you, you can wave your hand and hopefully I will see you. The background of our subject is, of course, the contemporary crisis or challenge in the Eurozone and in Europe in general. Can hardly be anybody unaware of the challenges to financial stability, to budgets, to growth, but also challenges or changes in the fundamental structure of what's happening in the EU, and, it seems to me, in relations among the EU's key members, including, of course, and especially Germany. So today I asked our guests to be prepared to address the question of a new Germany in a new EU along the following dimensions, which may come up as we proceed. Germany and its relations to the European Union. Germany in its role in Europe. Germany and its relations with other EU members. And finally, Germany in terms of its relations, the German government, with its own people. I hope we'll touch on some or all of these topics. We're scheduled to run to 1:30. We will run till then or until the questions run out. I'm going to begin by posing a question to Steve, which may be picked up by others. And it really is the fundamental one. Hold on, it looks like Gary Marks may be joining us.
Oh, here we go.
Hello, Gary. Can you see us?
I can indeed. It's good to, good to be with you.
I'm glad we can see you. I've introduced all of the guests and I've introduced you. We have participants from UNC Chapel Hill, from Texas. We have Alex Privitera in Washington, and participants from the Bayer Corporation here in Pittsburgh. I have asked everyone to please mute their microphones when they're not speaking, just to keep the ambient noise down. And I was about to pose the first question to Steve. The question is this: are we in fact seeing a fundamentally new situation in the EU with regard to the long-standing role of Germany in the EU, Germany's relationship with the European Union as an organization? Is this something that is a fundamental difference from what we've seen in the past, or are we overreacting?
Thank you, Ron. I think you've set out an ambitious agenda for us today for the time that we have, and of course an ambitious opening question. I guess for me, the short answer would be no. I don't think that we're seeing a fundamentally different Germany or a fundamentally different situation. What struck me as I was thinking about the overarching question that you posed for today, a new Germany in a new EU, well, how do we want to define a new Germany and as of when? I think if one looks back at Germany's development since the fall of the wall, since reunification, we've seen a Germany which has been increasingly engaged with Europe, with the environment, with its neighbors, but also with the global environment as a whole. And so, I mean, I guess for me, no, I wouldn't say that there's a fundamental sea change in terms of what we're seeing. One of the things that I've been grappling with as I've been watching what's going on in Europe is it seems as if the debate that we're having at the moment that's unfolding is very similar to the debate that we've been hearing about for decades about whether or not there needs to be a core and a periphery in the European Union, or whether Europe is coming together at two speeds. And what we're in fact seeing is that there is a core and a periphery when it comes to the European Union.
All right. Others want to address that question about whether or not this is a fundamentally new or a continuation of some aspect of EU relations, including core and periphery, or the German relationship?
Sure, I would.
Okay, Gary, go first, and then I'll call on Alex.
Thank you. Well, there's always something new in the European Union, because the European Union develops in a way that every time I look at it from year to year, I'm amazed by how one can't predict what's going to happen. This is another example of that. So it's the continuation of unpredictability. But sitting here in Berlin as a Brit, something fundamental has happened. And that is the European Union. We used to talk about two speeds, one speed, whether it will take more or less time for all the European countries to form some coherent whole. That's history. That's history. The UK, I'll make a very flat statement, and I think this will hold up. The UK will never be a member of the Eurozone. Now, I wouldn't have said that a couple of years ago, or 3 or 4 years ago, or even when the Eurozone was created. But I really can't think of a single scenario at this moment which would lead the UK to be a member of the Eurozone. Now, what's also happened is that the Eurozone has become a much thicker polity than it was ever conceived to be. There really is a set of ins and outs, and the UK is leading the outs. And so the conception of what the European Union is, we really have to rethink this. And we have to think about whether the Eurozone really is going to be the polity that will emerge out of this, or whether there's going to be some set of European unions that are going to exist side by side.
Alex.
Yes, I agree with Gary. I also agree with Steve. But first of all, maybe to the question of what has fundamentally changed, if anything has fundamentally changed. And I was just going back to an old biography, well, it's not actually quite old, but of Helmut Schmidt, and what kind of challenges he faced when he became chancellor. And the first thing that he said in a letter to a colleague was, the biggest issue I am concerned about, and this is in the mid-70s, is the Europe falling apart. So in a way, I'm not saying we are replaying a crisis or one of the many crises that we had before, because, you are the academics and history never repeats itself completely. But there are some elements that we have seen in the past, particularly in the 70s, when we also had a fundamental discussion about economic policies between members of the then European community, and particularly between Germany and the US when it comes to addressing fears of inflation or addressing economic imbalances. And at the time, the question where a lot of people were asking were the same that a lot of people are asking today, which were, is Germany asserting itself within Europe? And does this mean that we're entering a new chapter? I believe that we're not entering a new chapter. I think that there has been some kind of flirtation on the German side, first with Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, and then with Angela Merkel, at least during the first years of her tenure, to play a slightly more national, I wouldn't call it nationalistic, but a slightly more national card. And Angela Merkel has discovered, painfully discovered, that in Europe that doesn't make any sense, and that ultimately Germany loses if it doesn't bind itself more closely to the European Union. The question is basically whether Germany leads or not. And if Germany leads, there's backlash, and if Germany doesn't lead, there's a void. So the only answer that we are hearing from our counterparts in Germany now is that closer integration must be the answer. And basically we now have to convince, and this is not the first attempt, we have to convince France, which still is the main partner within the Eurozone, to go down that more integrationist path that France, because of its tradition, is still reluctant to go to. The question of stronger intergovernmental coordination or stronger integration. And I believe that Angela Merkel, having played with the card of stronger intergovernmental evolution within the Eurozone, has now come to the conclusion that that's not going to work, and there needs to be indeed closer integration. In a way, it's a little bit of a triumph for the old guard, around Wolfgang Schäuble. We'll see whether it works, but I think that's the discussion within the Eurozone at the moment. Whether Britain will be in or out in the distant future, I really don't know. I just know that, for instance, the Italian government under Mario Monti is making extraordinary attempts to bind the UK to this process, not to get the UK within the Eurozone, of course, but to avoid a situation of an empty chair. And the Italians and also the Germans, to some degree, are still convinced that the UK has a big and constructive role to play, especially when it comes to deepening the single market.
I'm not necessarily prepared to yield on this question, so let me put this in another way, in an even more contentious manner. What if one argued that while we may not be seeing a fundamental change, we may be seeing a continuation to some extent of trends earlier? What we are seeing is an attempt by the Merkel government to essentially establish the German economy on a Europe-wide scale. It's widely recognized that the European Central Bank was set up with, according to German strictures, as the price for surrendering the Deutschmark. And that what we're seeing now is an even broader establishment of supranational policies according to a German model as the price for German contribution for financial stability. Now, while it may not be fundamentally different, it seems to represent a sea change.
Ron, I think can I come in on that? Because I think I think you're absolutely right. I think there are very precise ways in which the German model is being exported to the rest of Europe. Because in 2003, Germany exceeded the 3% budget deficit rule. And the reason it did that was because the German lender was spending too much money. They were engaging in budget deficits. And so in 2010, there was a series of legislative acts which were intended to extend federal supervision of German lender in imposing austerity plans. And it's this model that is being exported to Europe. But in doing that, there is enormous potential conflict, both between the haves, Germany, but alongside Germany, Finland, the Netherlands, even some Eastern European countries who are not engaged in demanding a bailout, but who are providing the bailouts, and the countries of the South. And the fundamental problem is, can the Southern countries escape from their budget deficits while engaging in austerity? And economists are totally divided about this. And so the economic conflicts that characterize European policy now and moving ahead are deeper than they have ever been because the stakes are so high.
So, I guess I would say that I don't know that this is part of a grand strategy to export the German economy Europe-wide. But I do think that there is a tremendous amount of concern in Germany that we've all been seeing, and that there is a need, certainly from the German perspective, for more common regulation when it comes to fiscal and economic policy.
All right. I'm going to yield the floor to see if there are other questions that either members of the audience here or at other sites want to ask. What's the problem? Oh, sorry, Professor Hake. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Since I was advertised as the one intended to introduce culture into the equation, I thought I'd do that. And want to ask another question back. In what ways do we limit ourselves in economic and political debate by locking into these labels of national sovereignty, but also national identity? Because one thing that I have certainly noticed in the debate about the Euro crisis and the future of the EU is that very often cultural stereotypes are used to explain economic and political processes. And at a time of globalization, where allegedly these differences get leveled out, we seem to like to go back to the most hackneyed stereotypes about national character to explain processes that, such as the global economy, that seem to evade rational explanations. And so to go back to what my colleague said earlier, the discussion we've had so far reminds me very much of the paranoia that Maggie Thatcher for a moment sparked after German unification about whatever, like the Nazi boots already marching all over Europe. So my question to all of us, are we not resorting to a kind of retrograde image of German culture, Greek culture, French culture, that in many ways limits our imagination of the possibilities available to address these problems?
Good question. Who wants to handle that potentially calm question?
I've done some research on this actually, so I think it's a very interesting question, the issue of identity. And I think what one finds in among the young people in Europe is that there is a greater cosmopolitanism. There's a greater degree of European identity among young people. One of my PhD students has done a study of the views of students who study abroad. And I think many people in the audience may have either done this or are thinking about this. And this really does make a difference in the way in which young people perceive national identity, the experience of studying in a foreign country. But there are enormous variations. And what one finds is that, particularly on the far right, the problems, the issues, the challenge to national sovereignty has given rise to a reaction. And one could describe this as a nationalist reaction. So on the one side, if you look to the future in a generational perspective, one would say, yes, European integration is leading to a deepening of attachment, loyalty, identity to Europe. But if you look in the short term and you look at the pattern of party competition on Europe, you see that it's the far right that has the kind of the spontaneity and the agenda setting on this. So it's a very interesting and very important question.
But I guess this ties in. I actually wanted to try to draw Alex out a little bit more, and the comment that you made a little while ago about how a more national position, beginning with Gerhard Schröder, continued by Angela Merkel, ties in with closer integration at the same time. Because I would agree with you. I don't think that they're mutually exclusive, but actually that they can be done simultaneously. And I thought that you were touching on something there that's worth developing a little further.
What my impression was, I witnessed Chancellor Schröder, and his first sort of headline about European policies was, das Ende der Scheckbuchdiplomatie, the end of the checkbook diplomacy, which he clearly linked to previous German governments and to Helmut Kohl. When crunch time comes, the Germans are always going to put the money on the table and bail everybody out. And clearly he tried to put the sort of red line in the sand there. With the experiences that he had in the lead up to the Iraq War, then he, was pushed closer to Chirac, and he eventually also found out that basically Europe was now too tightly wound around him as a German chancellor that he couldn't really escape that sort of barely hug. And I think that Angela Merkel has gone through the same process in a way, because everybody agrees on the fact that when there was the attempt to have a European constitution, and Joschka Schröder, for instance, was on this commission, then it was downgraded, and what we now have is a so-called constitutional treaty, and the Lisbon Treaty, that coincided with a phase of Europe fatigue, and that's basically what happened with the eruption of the Euro crisis has been a wake-up call for Europeans that Europe fatigue and just trying to do things loosely by the book that had been established in the previous 10 years is not going to do the trick, and that there is Europe can't get into a stall speed, because if it stalls, it then falls, and they have discovered that painfully. And I believe that they have drawn the right conclusions. I also believe, though, that this balance between domestic policies and European policies is a very difficult one, and how to strike it well will really be the one of the main tests and challenges in the upcoming months, especially when more money has to be put on the table to erect firewalls, to save Greece. They say Greece for now, but the question will arise again in the future, and how to explain that to the general public. And the fact that Angela Merkel, for instance, has decided to campaign for Sarkozy in France, that is a novelty, clearly. Helmut Kohl has done the same for Mitterrand in '92, but that was to endorse the Maastricht Treaty in the referendum that the French held to support and to endorse the Maastricht Treaty, not to endorse a particular person in a political process, in an election campaign. Angela Merkel is doing that for Sarkozy, which is, for many was a sign that she doesn't understand what the signs are in France, and that would actually be, have a sort of detrimental effect to Sarkozy's prospects. On the other hand, though, there is this tight closeness, and many people now speak of Merkozy rather than Sarkozy and Merkel, and this is the upcoming presidential election in France. Paradoxically, is an election about Europe. And this is also a new thing, because, during election cycles, we all sort of retreat to our national domestic selves, and we address domestic problems, well knowing that those problems cannot be solved if there isn't a European component, but we act towards, the politicians do act towards their voters as if there was a national answer to all these problems. And, for the first time, Merkel and Sarkozy have come to the conclusion, no, actually that's not the case, and we will try to mutually benefit from interacting in this very domestic, traditionally very domestic affair, which is a national action process.
I'd like to return to Professor Hake's question with the following quote from Gordon Rachman in the Financial Times. He was right. He says, "Across Southern Europe, the ugly German is back, accused of driving other nations into penury, deposing governments, and generally barking orders at all and sundry." The Economist recently referred to Germany's heavy hand. Now, to some extent, this is really not the resurrection of an old stereotype, but there is something peculiarly German, or should we say anti-German, in the reaction to this approach. And I wonder if I could get the reaction of the panelists to this kind of quote, or this kind of orientation.
I think, first of all, the first thing to be said about that is that it is grossly unfair. That is, you might call it the resurrection of a new stereotype. It is unfair. Germany is in a very difficult situation with respect to this, because it is German funding that is the most that is larger than that provided by any other country in terms of the bailouts. I think there is, one definitely picks up this national reaction that's been mobilized, as I mentioned before, by the far right. Interestingly, and the big question in German politics is there is no populist far right party gaining significant electoral support in Germany. So one doesn't see the reciprocation of those national stereotypes from the German side. But there is an element of not truth, but you can understand what is happening. And what is happening is, the question is, will austerity achieve the goals that it is presumed to achieve? Can you really expect Greece, or for that matter, Portugal, to grow their way out of their current budget deficits by achieving a consistently lower rate of wage growth, wage inflation, to become more competitive than Germany, and thereby to export more than they import from other European countries, Eurozone countries? And so the question I think that's being asked is not, whether the German policy is jackbooted. Obviously it is not. But I think there is the question of whether it is effective, and whether the exportation of the German policies that have been imposed consensually on the lender are going to work in the European context over the medium term. So you can understand where the angst and where the anger comes from, and particularly given the fact that in countries like Greece, these policies are imposing very great levels of economic inequality in societies that are bearing a very heavy burden of state and economic retrenchment.
May I weigh in?
Please.
Yes. I will just quote a recent speech of Guido Westerwelle, who came to see the Washington crowd just a few weeks ago, when all this discussion about austerity only was finally leaving some traces in the German debate as well. He came to tell us that by no means do I advocate austerity only. Apart from the debt issue, the widening gap in competitiveness between Eurozone members is the most important cause of the crisis. Budget cuts alone, he said, will not do the trick. Structural reforms are essential for the creation of new growth. They're also essential for the long-term cohesion of the Eurozone. Now, I completely agree with the fact that in Greece, finding the right balance between the two is increasingly difficult. But I think that when the German officials point out the balance between structural reforms and austerity, I think they point towards mainly Spain and Italy, and believe that if Spain and Italy enact some structural reforms, and two countries seem to be on the path, on the right track at least, that some of the competitiveness can be regained in those big peripheral countries. And therefore, the sort of economic divergence and imbalances that have grown over the past 15 years can be slightly reduced. Nobody expects them to become Germany, but at least those imbalances, there needs to be more convergence rather than divergence. And they think that by doing that, there is a chance of achieving this goal. The Monti government as well believes that this is necessary to get Italy out of its situation, lack of competitiveness, slow growth for the past 15 years, and clearly there needs to be a balance between austerity and structural reforms. The big question mark is Greece, because everybody, I think, agrees, and even yesterday in Brussels, 13 hours of talks to find an agreement that basically, to put it bluntly, kicks the can down the road. We gained some time, but we probably don't solve the Greek situation. And I think that this is still a question that the Eurozone partners are grappling with. How do you get Greece out of its situation without bringing it completely down to its knees.
Yes, Professor Hake.
I want to go back to the question of national stereotypes. It does not surprise me that in the media and also by politicians, all these carnars are kind of being pulled out of the closet. But one of the speakers, I think it was Gary Marx, used the key word that we need to think about here, and that is economic inequality. National stereotypes are often evoked when what we're really talking about is economic inequality. Think of the stereotypes evoked between the East and the West Germans after unification. They were denounced as lazy. Think of the stereotypes about the Poles after the collapse of communism, fantasies of cheap Polish laborers, basically destroying healthy wages for German workers. Think of this whole rhetoric about the lazy but fun-loving Mediterraneans versus the North European Protestant parsimonious people. What is at the core of all these narratives, which obviously are very easy to communicate to voters, is the fact of economic inequality in the Eurozone. For a long time, people have tried to ignore that, and perhaps it was a mistake to let Greece join the Eurozone when it joined, and I'm sure discussions about Turkey will be influenced by what is happening now. The fact is that we have a center, we have a periphery, we have barely developed countries, and we have highly developed countries. But fact is also that Germany and others as export nations have benefited tremendously from Greece being in the Eurozone. And so I see no problem for Germany now shouldering the main burden of bailing Greece out. But I think the stereotypes are used to obscure that fact of economic inequality.
I think you're right.
Yes.
Well,
sorry,
yes,
go ahead, Gary.
Yeah, I think that's true. When you ask people on the street about whether they would be willing to subsidize or share their money with others, they're much more likely to do so when they recognize some commonality of fate. This is actually a question that's been much researched in Canada, because the question is, to what extent could you have federal welfare policies in Canada, given the differences between people in Quebec and elsewhere? And so one of the say within the United States or within Germany, there's a great commitment to some kind of welfare system, stronger in European countries than in the United States for sure, but much weaker when it comes to Europe as a whole and in terms of shifting funds from country to country. And so what you find are those same patterns where younger people who are more Eurocentric are more willing to do so, and people whose identities are much more exclusively national are much less willing to do so. And I think you're also right about the value of the single market for Germany, because Germany right now has this wonderful export machine, which is based primarily on automobiles and machinery products of diverse kinds. And the export potential for those is really amazing, not only to the Eurozone, but to BRIC countries as well. And so what you don't find in Germany is a debate about the value of the Eurozone, European Monetary Union itself. And so there has been a ground change, I think, in the German debate on this, because there is now a recognition that the old policy of having monetary union in the absence of economic union won't work. And there's a real willingness now among the German elites, less so in the population, but you find echoes there too, a willingness to foresee real economic and fiscal union. So it's interesting that a crisis in Europe has really generated a tremendous impetus towards policies that even a few years ago would have been perceived as utopian.
Gary, I think the point that you just made about the benefit of the single market and certainly the Eurozone to Germany, there's no debate about that Germany has benefited significantly. You're in Germany now, but the sense that I have from people that I've spoken with, the kinds of things that I've been reading, is that many Germans, both at the political elite level, but also in the public, have a sense that they've been vindicated because the austerity plans have paid off for Germany. Last week there was a report released by the OECD that was basically a report on Germany. It was fairly positive in terms of how the German economy is doing. The biggest challenge, according to the report, apparently, is that they're still in need of workers, and so that's of course a good problem to have given the economy right now. But it's also a indication that the Kurzarbeit plan paid off, that one did not have to lay people off because the economy was slowing down, and that the economy was in a better position to pick up when things started picking up again. So I can understand, coming back to Ron's questions, right? I can, and I guess, Gary, your first point, this balancing act, in a sense, that in Germany, many Germans feel austerity measures have paid off and perhaps can and should be transferred to others. But the question is, can one really transfer them? I mean, Alex made some points about some statements that Westerwelle and others have been making about the balancing of austerity with structural change. That, I don't think there's anybody that would disagree with that. But the question is, how does one take some of these models, some of these initiatives, but apply them elsewhere when there is no one model fits all for the countries that are being challenged at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, those are very good questions. Germany has this incredible combination of good deeds and good luck. The good deeds were that there were difficult choices that were made by Schroeder and others pretty early on. But there was good luck too, and good luck in two fundamental senses. One, Germany had a structure of industrial relations, coherent industrial relations, strong unions that were moderate. And so they could negotiate with employers in the expectation that if they constrain their wages, that profits would increase and productivity would increase, and it would redound to the benefit of workers in unions. That was one piece of good luck that doesn't exist. The structure of industrial relations is much more variegated and disorganized in Italy, in Greece, in Portugal, and in Spain. The other piece of good luck for Germany is that no matter how hard China tries, it's incapable of producing BMWs and Mercedes or Porsches, Audis. And it is also, China is able to compete in a whole range of financial products, a whole range of industrial products. But what it is unable to do, and what's very difficult to do, is to replicate the success of small German engineering companies of less than 2,000 employees, who actually control or export 60% of a particular mechanical good that's used in producing factories. So the two core areas of the German economy and German exports and export success, automobiles and engineering, are actually areas where the BRICS are where they can't compete effectively. And so we really are in the kind of the German decade, in the way that some while ago we were in a Japanese decade. or an American decade. So there are particular constellation of factors that make Germany a kind of a wunderkind, a kind of a economic miracle, repeat. But I do think that those factors, like the other cases I mentioned, are not going to be durable for a matter of decades. So the German success that we see now, it's a wonderful basis for overcoming this economic crisis in Europe. But I do wish, talking personally, that there was less commonality between the German elite's emphasis on austerity, very similar to the policies put forward by Republicans in the current political situation in the United States. People talk about the affinity of Obama and Europe. Not true. If you talk about economic affinity, it's the Republicans who talk about no bailouts, and the Germans who are talking about let's have austerity, let's impose the costs of retrenchment and economic change on the poorer countries. So I do wish that we would have had a more Obama-like, if I can use the term, set of more adventurous policies in Germany and in Europe. Throughout this whole process, in my view, Chancellor Merkel, a delightful person, I was in a meeting with her not so long ago, big meeting, she has really been kind of behind the curve. She's a wonderful, consensual compromiser. And it just so happened that the kind of situation we have found ourselves in is one in which it would have been very beneficial to have a more active and adventurous kind of a policy that was pursued actually with relative effectiveness in the United States of America.
Can I weigh in on this one, because I completely agree with Gary, and there's a little episode that during the past two, and I'm going to mention him again. The Italian Prime Minister Mario Monti was here, and he was asked, according to him, he was asked by Obama during his meeting, how do you get through to Angela Merkel? And he admitted, Monti admitted to the Italian press afterwards that he was quite flattered by this question, because he knew that Angela Merkel and Barack Obama had a long-standing relationship. They talk on the phone many, many times. They have been trying to closely coordinate on everything that had to do with the world economy in the sort of G20 forum. So he was quite flattered by this question. And his answer to Obama, according to him, was that macroeconomic arguments, sheer numbers, trying to convince her or convince the Germans, he said, with those arguments will not work, because in a way, he said, Germans are still stuck in a pre-Adam Smith concept of the economy, where growth is the reward for good behavior. And therefore, just by making arguments about sheer numbers will never get through to them. You need to try to tackle them differently. And he said, and that's why within the European Union, are trying to stress so much the need to further implementation of steps that get us into a real single market, even in areas where the Germans haven't been very good, particularly the service sector, for instance. So in a way, he was suggesting if you try to get them into a moral corner and remind them of some of their own shortcomings, maybe you might get them to accept your arguments, but only focusing on numbers will not do the trick. And this goes back to the question of whether Germany feels vindicated. After all, it was the sick man of Europe for about 10 years, and everybody was complaining about this sort of giant in the middle of Europe not generating enough growth for the rest of the European Union. And there were all these Irish tigers in the north, and, you know, look at how much growth there is in the periphery. And clearly that's, you know, that has had some impact on how Germans view themselves and have viewed themselves in the past 10 years. And with the eruption of financial crisis in 2008, they basically said, see, after all, our model is still the only one really working, because look at the destruction that the sole focus on the financial industry has brought about. And that brings us also to one question that I wanted to ask Gary, what his experience is in Germany when it comes to talk about ordoliberalism, basically. You know, some people here say that Merkel seems to be influenced by that economic train of thought that basically is, you know, liberal in the German sense of the word, so free market and classical economy on one side, but with a strong state hand that creates or makes sure that there's a level playing field and everybody abides by the rules. And some people say that in a way, this, even if the Social Democrats are a bit more flexible on that question, but that this thought or this theory has in a way left deep marks on the thinking of policymakers in Germany, and that in a way they're trying to, you know, reply the model on a much bigger scale at the European level.
I mean, it's been a very tough course for Merkel, because if there's an "I told you so" element to the German position on this, because those who were most opposed, most concerned about Portugal, Italy, and particularly Greece coming into the Eurozone was Germany. At the same time, German politicians told their constituents in no uncertain terms that the shift towards a common currency would not involve a shift to an economic union, to a fiscal union. And there were people who asked very sharp questions about this and said, are we engaging in a road towards something that resembles a state, even a federal state, but a state nonetheless? And German politicians at the time, we're talking about the 1990s, turned around and said, no, we are envisaging a currency union in the absence of an economic union in the broader sense. So there's been a real gap in Germany. This is very much constrained Merkel's hand. There's been a gap between the functional necessity of creating a fiscal union, of having serious bailouts, having a serious potential, economic potential to deal with crises as they develop, and the orientation of the public, which is much more hesitant, much more, you'd have to say, Euro-skeptical than that of the educated cosmopolitan elite. This is true in all European countries, and it's true in Germany too. So I don't think that Merkel's policy has really been the result of a kind of a philosophical commitment to economic liberalism, perhaps, so much as it has been an attempt to deal with the tensions in German politics, the hesitancy with which Germans have dealt with the economic problems as they've arisen. And the unintended consequence of all of that has been to vastly increase the cost of the bailouts, because the one thing that economic markets cannot stand is that uncertainty about the possibility of getting repaid when they buy, when investment bankers and investors buy government bonds. So I think one sees it's a subterranean kind of conflict or pressure in Germany, but it's very real between the caution and the cautiousness, the hesitancy of the public, and the economic circumstances and pressures as they have developed over time.
I want to give some of the members of our audience, participants here and elsewhere, a chance to ask questions. Just ask that you identify yourself by name and institution.
Yeah, so my name is Gregor Thum. I'm teaching here German history at the University of Pittsburgh. I have a question. You know, there's too much talk about this cultural difference, or what you just mentioned before, between German austerity policy in the world, in the United States especially, that there's an understanding for how important stimulus packages actually are. And I really think perception of describing this as being, you know, Germans just behind is maybe a bit short, or jumping too short, because I think there are three fundamental experiences that inform exactly the skepticism about stimulus packages. And these is, first of all, you know, the Federal Republic of Germany was always a transfer union which transferred money, enormous amount of money between different states. That was the first experience. The second one is the enormous transfer of money from West Germany to East Germany. So this is now you're talking about 150 billion a year for 20 years now. And the third is, of course, that the European Union always was a body that shifted money to less developed regions to develop them. And I think the results of that are sometimes not convincing, that there's actually a strong conviction that money alone doesn't help. You have to change economic behavior, social behavior, you have basically to change the culture. And what I'm seeing in the moment actually is, where I understand here of Merkel's policy, which is actually really driven by strong support of German elites and far into the public, is actually using the crisis to change something. And it's a completely different approach to Greece compared then to Portugal. Countries that both actually have problems, but Portugal gets money and Greece not, but not so easily. And I think this was my question, do you see here a connection with these three experiences, that transfer of money not always really helped to level out imbalances when cultures don't change?
Steve, I mean, very briefly, I would say that part of Germany's behavior today is a direct reflection on the transfer payments to Eastern Germany following reunification and years of austerity, in a sense, and years of structural change as well. And that experience has guided part of the response to the euro crisis right now. I mean, I would agree with you completely on that, yes.
Yes, I would also agree. And basically, German policymakers would remind us that it took them 10 years to get Germany back on track. And clearly, you know, they wouldn't tell that openly, but they don't expect, for instance, Greece to get rid of its most pressing economic problems in a matter of a few years only. So it is clearly a long process, but what they're trying to change is a sort of narrative. So what they want to achieve is not to change Europe within a few months. After all, it took them, as I said, about 10 years. But what they need to do, and I think that they have recognized that, is to gain some time and to calm capital markets so that they can. Thanks to, on one hand, they need the pressure of capital markets to enforce some of the structural reforms that are now underway in some of the peripheral countries. And on the other hand, they also need capital markets at some point to quiet down because otherwise the stress on the periphery, particularly on the periphery, will be so big that we will still have a danger of a breakup of the Eurozone. And clearly, we can't accompany this process of structural reforms by having to ask us, you know, the question every second week whether the euro is going to break up or not.
Professor Hake, I know you have to leave and you had your hand up, so please.
Right. I want to add two perspectives, and both are really intended to move away from this presentist focus on Germany's strength. I was just reminded a book that actually comes out this year by Walter Lacoeur, After the Fall, who basically says, who diagnoses the end of the European dream and the decline of a continent, and focuses specifically in Germany, arguing that Germany will go under, it's simply the law of demographics. And so I think in our discussion about Germany's economic strength, we are doing ourselves a disservice if we only focus on policies and completely leave out Europe as a labor market, the problem of migration within the Eurozone and into the Eurozone, and the formidable demographic challenges that Europe will face in the next decades. My other point is that in discussing the current Euro crisis, we seem to resort to national paradigms focusing primarily on policies and politicians. But I think we need to take into account that a lot of the developments that have produced this crisis are absolutely transnational in origin and include the banks that operate entirely outside of these models of explanation. And one could make a reasonable argument that it was the banks that got Greece into this mess because they were happy to lend when they could. And now suddenly everyone is downgraded by Standard & Poor, and suddenly everyone screams crisis. So in short, what we need to look at is migration in the global context and neoliberal capitalism and the role of the banks in making decisions on which the politicians have only limited influence. And yes, I need to leave 10 to half. So if I suddenly walk off, that's why I have to go to class.
Well, are there people either in Texas or in North Carolina or at Bayer who would like to ask a question? Please speak up and identify yourself.
Just speak.
Okay, yes, I'm Holger Morov. I'm teaching here also the European Union at UNC. And I have a question and a comment for those who talked about the transfer union. The EU has always had, at least after the first round of enlargement, after Britain and Denmark and Ireland joined, a regional policy with its express purpose to make those economic regions, the periphery, fit for the degree of competition inside the Union, right? This regional policy is based on regions, not on nations, right? So money does not go to member states, but only to regions within member states, which of course is exactly so one cannot exploit the kind of net contributor to net recipient in a politicized way, right? Even Germany gets money from the regional funds, the industrial backward regions, even Sweden and Finland for their sparsely populated areas. So redistribution has always been taking place, and the EU was always very careful to avoid the kind of nationalistic debate, net contributors against net recipients. On the other hand, we do find redistribution to be highly politicized even in Germany. The Länderfinanzausgleich, where poor lender receive money from rich lenders, is always questioned. And in the United States, and many of us are here right now, we do have a no bailout clause, right? States are not being bailed out, neither are cities or counties. That's why California pays different interest rates on its loans than Massachusetts or Ohio. And I'm very surprised that we have such a strong American perspective. This is exactly the no bailout clause that is now put into question inside the EU, which is working in the US. Why can't it work in the EU?
Can I respond to that interesting point, Holger? Hello, Holger. It's nice to see you here. Yes, the structural funds or the regional funds are a very interesting example of a targeted policy which is intended to increase the potential for indigenous economic growth in the regions. It amounts to about 0.4% of European GDP. So we're not talking about something that is massive as far as redistribution goes. It's not like the Länderfinanzausgleich, but it is a significant amount of money in absolute terms. And I think that this is something that I've actually studied. I think these policies have been pretty effective. They've been conducted very closely with regional and local actors. The policies have been variegated in terms of, in certain areas there have been roads. I know the Algarve quite well, and it's certainly contributed to the economic development of the Algarve to put in a infrastructure, not only a physical infrastructure, but also a electronic infrastructure. So I think, you know, there are ways in which one can try to frame redistribution and support of the less developed regions in a way that is economically effective. There's one difference between the United States and the plans that are being put forward in Europe now, and that is the European plans are much more rigid than is the situation in the United States. There are several states in the United States which have balanced budgets in their constitutions, but not all. And this is not a central requirement. In Europe, it would be a central requirement. So this is one of those areas which, if this comes to pass, and I expect that it will come to pass, where we can say the European Union is more centralized than is the United States.
Yes, but even in the fiscal compact, there is a clause that allows the member states to exceed those budget limits if their economy is under severe stress, which is basically a replay, more or less, of the Maastricht criteria. Sorry, not the Maastricht criteria, but the old growth and stability pacts. We have, and it's debatable whether this new fiscal compact really is so different from the old growth and stability pact. It is basically an attempt to reiterate that growth and stability pact, rename it, so that nobody has to be reminded that it actually in 2003, France and Germany breached the rules of the growth and stability pacts and exceeded the Maastricht criteria. So we now have something which is in this infant state only an intergovernmental treaty between 25. It is unclear how it will be linked to the rest of the European institutions once it gets going, presumably after ratification in summer or early fall, and then we'll see whether it really takes us on this path to a closer fiscal and economic union.
As I warned when we began, or advised, I wanted the focus of this discussion to be on Germany, and it has, and now I'm going to drive it even more in that direction by raising issues to some extent we've touched on, but I want to hear a bit more about the impact of this dynamic on German domestic politics. Has this posture that Angela Merkel has taken, faute de mieux, helped her or hurt her? Is this a political advantage, or does she take a risk in blithely suggesting that there ought to be monitoring of the Greek economy, or if when her governments suggest that maybe the Greeks should put off their elections, is she running up against a German hostility or likely to gain support from these actions? Or will the effect be negligible?
Well, one of the interesting things in German politics is that this issue is not subject to party competition. There is debate within the CDU about the advisability, about how tough to be with Greece. Wolfgang Schäuble has taken a pretty kind of tough line, despite the fact that he is very pro-European and could be called a federalist, has taken the kind of the tough line on Greece. Merkel has been a little bit softer. So there are shades of opinion and some disagreements within the CDU, and particularly within the CSU, which has always been more Eurosceptical. The Free Democrats, the FDP, are more skeptical also. But the big elephant in the room, the big issue in German politics, is is the non-existence of something that in other countries would exist, and that is there is no populist party of the right in Germany, and there is a very strong elite consensus, but it's an elite consensus that such a party should not exist for obvious historical reasons. And yet, if you poll Germans about immigrants and about a variety of other issues that have been picked up by populist right parties in other countries, you find that there is a bit of a vacuum on the right. And there have been, I can't go into it here, but there have been attempts by various individuals, unsuccessful attempts, and some very small parties that have never made it electorally, which means getting more than 5% to cross that hurdle. There have been attempts, but if there is, as long as there's no populist right party in Germany, so European issues are much softer. They're much less the subject of intense party competition than, say, in France or in most other European countries, including, say, the Netherlands. So it's the absence of a party that is really, in my mind, the most salient characteristic of German party competition on Europe and on several other issues as well.
Yes,
that party. Go ahead, Alex.
That party could be called Zeitung in Germany, where the popular tabloid that has basically tried to fill that void for forever, I would say, since it was founded. But clearly, once the Bild Zeitung generates a headline, and those headlines very often are sort of anti-Greek or anti-bailout, then particularly the union, I mean the CDU, CSU, the two Christian democratic parties in Germany, have to take those views of the tabloids Bild Zeitung into account in some fashion or another. That explains why there's so many voices sometimes popping up here and there from backbenchers railing against either the euro or the Greeks. But then basically, it creates some noise, but the decisions are usually not made by those backbenchers.
I would like to ask our colleagues at Bayer, if they're still on, I can't see a video of you, if anyone there has a question. They're working. They're working. I wanted to get you before you went back to work, since we don't ever have to go back to work.
There you go. I'm sorry, we don't seem to have a question at this point. We are still here, by the way.
Okay, good. This is the first time I've been able to see you. I'm glad you're still there. Steve, you want to weigh in on the domestic?
I guess we've talked. I think that the notion about the lack of a fight and how that influences the debate is a really good point. And one of the things that I was hoping we would get to, although it's a little bit outside of the periphery of today's discussion, is I kind of think that Merkel has other problems at home right now. Having witnessed Christian Wolff, the Bundespräsident, stepping down, I think has put her government into a bit of a difficult place. I wouldn't say a tailspin exactly, but I do think that she's juggling an awful lot of internal domestic issues at the same time as she's trying to be a strong European. And that some of these domestic issues are undoubtedly weakening her position, but also the coalition government in general.
Which would in turn weaken her standing Europe-wide. Yes. In terms of the kind of the electoral strategy, I mean, it's a good point. In terms of the electoral strategy that Merkel confronts, her main problem is whether the little Liberal Party, the FDP, with which she is in coalition, whether it passes the 5% barrier in the next federal election. And if it does not, who or what
could the Christian Democrats ally with? And so this puts a great deal of focus on the Green Party, the Grüne. Could they be induced to go into a coalition with the Christian Democrats? At the moment, you'd have to say that this is very unlikely. But I think Merkel is a pretty popular leader. I think the Christian Democrats are actually doing quite well in public opinion polls. It's very difficult to tell how well this would translate into an election, a general election. But the FDP has really faced some problems, and it has looked possible and perhaps even likely that they would have difficulty meeting the 5% barrier. And if they don't get 5%, if they get 4.9% of the national vote, this would deny them proportional representation in the Bundestag. And so the only way that the Christian Democrats, that Merkel could remain chancellor, would be for her party to either get 50% of the seats or to find another coalitional partner. And both of those are very unlikely. So you may see some very interesting dynamics in the next election where the Christian Democrats may turn around to some of their supporters and say, look, if you'd like to give the Free Democrats your first vote to keep them above water, we will not object to that. It's a very difficult policy to propose because you don't want too many of your voters doing that. But that would be a real threat to the existing government. The other thing that's happened in German politics is that the Greens have really been shooting around in the public opinion polls. Quite recently, they were credited with more than 20% of the total vote, which would be a kind of a breakthrough for them. Most of that support coming at the expense of the FDP, but also the Social Democrats. So one senses in Germany some kind of generational shift whereby the party of the left, the main party, or the party would be shared, would not simply be the Social Democrats, which focus on economic issues, which have union support from the working classes, but also, and perhaps rather, the Greens, which is more of a middle-class party and which emphasizes cultural issues more than economic issues. So German politics.
Sorry, and given how good Merkel is tactically when it comes to politics, one could imagine if this trend were to hold, that she would have a bigger menu of options to choose from if the Liberals don't get the 5%, the minimum of 5% of in the general election.
It also suggests, if I'm hearing all of you correctly, that a crucial determinant in this election will not be the issue of the EU or austerity in Europe, that will and it will play out on the basis of other things, not on the question of Germany's relations with the EU or its relations with other partners, including France. Is that your assessment?
I believe it will play a role. Not necessarily the bilateral relationship with France, but I believe that as things stand at the moment, she's building the whole rationale of her being reelected in fall 2013 on the question of being a good manager in turbulent times, and that clearly has a European implication. The fact itself that she is campaigning for Sarkozy is also a huge bet because it can backfire for her as well a year later. And I think that she is betting big on Europe at the moment. Obviously, you know, it's more than a year and a half away, so many things can happen between now and then. But I believe that she is actually trying to turn Europe into a trump card, implying that the Social Democrats don't have the personalities to deal with such a crisis. And that has put the Social Democrats also in trouble because they are as pro-European as the chancellor, if not even more.
Yes, that's very true. Interestingly, I mean, the parties that are out of government, the Greens and the Social Democrats, are no less and actually slightly more pro-European or pro-federal than are the Christian Democrats. So it becomes a matter precisely of management of the economy. And so the biggest losers, if Europe was to face a even more serious crisis, would be number one, Barack Obama and his election, because it's coming up shortly, and the American economy is right at the point of breaking through into some very moderate but perhaps sustained growth, and Angela Merkel herself. So it's a matter of management in both cases. Can Europe keep going? Can the intensity of the crisis gradually lessen? Can we kind of muddle our way through? Can Greece stay in and not be subject to such intense polarization? So these are kind of questions about, can we just get a little bit of economic growth and stability out of this? And the elections of the two, largest Western democracies hang in the balance there. The person who's most concerned about this is President Obama, because we really need to sustain the growth in employment that has recently taken place in the United States.
Yeah, our next conversation is going to be about that. Did you want to say?
Well, I mean, I guess I just wanted to tie in with both of the last two comments, which is that, of course, if the situation in Europe gets worse, it will have an effect on Merkel when the election takes place. But as Alex points out, it's a little over a year and a half away, and a lot can happen between now and then. Gary just raised an interesting question, which is, of course, the philosophical question that we're all dealing with. Can Europe keep going? And there was a conference recently, the title of which struck me as being very appropriate, and that you and your team should be commended for convening this talk now, because it really is right on the pulse of what people are talking about and thinking about. The title of this other conference is Ganz Europa, Kern Europa oder gar kein Europa. So all of Europe, core of Europe, or no Europe. I feel like this debate that we've been having, this discussion that we've been having, is extremely timely because there are so many different ways in which this could pan out.
Yes. I mean, we're in a situation, it's a slightly uncomfortable situation because the situation is so dependent on the absence of unanticipated events. When Harold Macmillan was asked what were the most important things in his administration, former Prime Minister, he famously turned around and said, "Events, dear boy, events." And right now we're in a situation where if nothing dramatic happens, I expect that Europe will be able to muddle through. Greece will stay in the Eurozone, Portugal, Spain, Italy as well. But were some nasty event to take place, let's say a hard fall by China, or something else that we would not be able to predict right now, then all bets would be off, and we'd be in I think, quite a serious situation. And the one thing that human beings tend to do is they tend to extrapolate the existing situation into the future. And this is perhaps one of those situations in which that is the least plausible thing to do.
It only takes a small war in Iran to throw all the cards up in the air, basically. With oil prices spiking and that clearly having a direct effect on the economies of the West.
Of all of the oxymorons, I never expected to hear the notion of a small war in Iran is certainly one of them.
It was meant.
Meant ironically, did you say, Alex?
Ironic, yeah.
That's right. Well, I was going to ask one more question, and I'm going to pose it, but it's not going to be answered by the participants because it's a segue into our next discussion, hopefully a teaser to bring you back. Because of the events that we talked about that could have an impact on both domestic politics in Germany and on Europe's ability to go on in whatever form, will be, of course, the French elections. And I wanted to ask whether that will make a difference in Germany, whether or not Sarkozy wins or loses. However, as we say in the game show business, we are out of time. But our next conversation, to which I invite you all in March, will focus on elections in Europe, in particular the French, but also the Greek, and perhaps, if it's appropriate, the German. And we won't talk about the American. But I hope you'll come back then. We'll send out notices to all of you. I want to thank all of you for participating. Gary Marks in Berlin, thank you very much. Alex Privitera in Washington, members of the faculty and students at University of North Carolina, our friends at Bayer. Texas has left the building, and of course our good friend and supporter, Steve Sokol of the World Affairs Council. We hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.